Ha, ha.
Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello, minions. Let's talk about the Cloverfield paradox. Now, for those of you who are afraid of spoilers, here's the short version. The short version is I'm going to tell you today that it was good. It's not great. It's not 10 Cloverfield Lane, which was outstandingly great. But I think it can suffer in comparison to that a little bit. And I think if you had just sort of, I'm seeing some reviewers say, oh, if it hadn't been connected with Cloverfield, it would have not had any kind of traction. I actually think the opposite. I think it's a better movie than people are taking it to be. But John Goodman, Frank, in 10 Cloverfield Lane was just so unbelievably wonderful that I think it's rather like The Godfather, where the later Godfather movies are dismissed, I think, unfairly as bad movies. They are great movies, but they're just not the best cinema ever made, which is, you can put The Godfather in that category. And I think this is true for this. I mean, 10 Cloverfield Lane, as I'll talk about later, had some issues that caused audiences and some critics not to like it. Issues that I would disagree with, but I think are real valid concerns. In this case, I think by comparing it, by putting it into that as a franchise, we tend to look at this movie and say, like, well, it was not quite what I expected. I thought it was quite good. And so if you already have Netflix, I would suggest that you watch it. If you do not have Netflix, I would not get Netflix just for the purpose of seeing this one film. However, if you don't have Netflix, they have a lot of other content that combined with this would, I think, be really worthwhile getting it. Okay, so I'm done talking vaguely. And so from this point on, I'm going to talk in a way that's very spoilerish. So if you don't want to hear any spoilers to the review, stop now. Okay, so for the rest of you, just to make life simple, I'm going to talk about the movies as in Cloverfield 1, Cloverfield 2, and Cloverfield 3. And then later on, Cloverfield 4, which I know has not been released yet. And just for simplicity, because to say Cloverfield to Cloverfield Lane, the Cloverfield paradox can be awkward over time. So what I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to talk about what's bad about the movie. And then second, I'm going to talk about what I thought was good about the movie. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some things that I think might be a little bit controversial. I think that they're good, but I can see other people having problems with them. Okay, so the first thing that's bad about the movie, truthfully, is there are too many characters in it. And partly I think this is so you can have a lot of death scenes or interesting problems that characters have. But one particular doesn't need to be there, and that's the husband of Hamilton. I think his name's Michael. It seems like there's a subplot that's going to develop there, but no subplot really does develop. We have no information about Molly. Molly doesn't matter. There's not enough there to really make a strong connection between Molly and the dead kids, and his role as a kind of fatherly figure toward her. So I feel like that whole subplot should have just been left out or developed more, one of the two. And in terms of the characters, Hamilton herself is a kind of bland and uninteresting character. The only interesting thing about her is the revelation later on that she, in stealing power, has gotten her children killed. But even that is not that interesting. It seemed like they were setting us up for something like, oh, because of this, she's the one who's going to betray the crew because she wants to be with her children in this other reality, or something like that. But nope, it's just, I think, so we're supposed to have some sort of pathos for her, I didn't really feel both. I think both, frankly, in that case, because of the acting and the writing. I thought like what ended up in the end was not enough in terms of the writing for me to care about her, and frankly, I didn't feel like the character was even carried that well. I think also one thing that some people will find it very derivative, especially of, say, movies like Event Horizon, the kind of that sort of film. And it certainly owes a lot to those kinds of movies. I didn't find that so disturbing as I think maybe some other critics will. And I think it's a valid criticism. There's a lot in this that is potentially very that people will say, well, I've seen this before in other movies. Okay, so now let's talk about, but those are the problems that I have with it. Let's talk about what's really good in it. One thing that I think that's really good in it is the way that it is small in focus. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit. At first, it seems like it's not. Whole world in crisis, space station, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end, you really end up focusing on a very, very small group of characters. We have a little bit of back and forth with the two mission controls, one in China and one in the U.S., but even that is really limited. You don't get those established as characters. There isn't. You don't get Ed Harris standing there in a short sleeve button down, with in a control room full of people like you would in almost any other movie of this type. All those people are kind of pushed out of the story, and I think that's for the best, because in the case of Cloverfield 1, even though you had an entire city in crisis, the focus was on a very small group of people with a very limited perspective trying to figure out kind of what was happening. And really, in the end, still not completely figuring out what had gone on. And I think the strength of Cloverfield, which was also good but not great, the strength of Cloverfield was that it evoked this sort of sense crisis going on like September 11th or something like this, and that you have only a very limited perspective, and you're trying to make choices based on that without really knowing what's going on. Again, Cloverfield 2 or 10 Cloverfield Lane, we have very, very tightly connected. You have a little bit at the beginning where you've them connected with the outside world, but really these three people are a world unto themselves, and you see them responding to the world in this way. And I think also Cloverfield 3, we also keep the focus really tight, so tight that when an additional character is then added, screaming in the walls, the idea that there's someone else there is just shocking to them. And I think the audience also is led to think like, what is this? Because there can't be another person there. I think that's the strength of the Cloverfield, the Cloverfield anthology thus far. I use the word anthology for a reason. Is this kind of tight focus on small groups of people. The other thing I thought that was really very strong in it was the humor in it. This could have been just Event Horizon with the word Cloverfield stuck on it. But it is really quite a funny movie. There's a lot of lines which I think are both by the actors and then are written and then delivered by the actors in ways that really do get at. They're funny without sort of becoming campy or silly. One of my favorites is when someone asks, "What are we missing?" and I think Volk's response is, "We're missing the Earth." We have this sense of that they end up the worse things get. Actually, the more humor there is, especially by Chris O'Dowd, who just I think of all the actors, he's the one who takes a very difficult role, which is the role of I need to be funny while terrible things are happening without seeming like I'm yucking it up. And as things get worse, you get a sense that he's able to walk that balance and to say, this character is responding to this with humor because he literally has no other way to respond to what has just happened to him and what is going on. And so when we do finally see him in this scenario, where he's killed, where there's just no way to respond with humor, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't really get anything to say. He's just immediately killed in that way, just to take him out. And so I think the humor in this is really good to go along with the science fiction and the horror elements of it. I think it's balanced exactly right. All right, so some things which I think are going to be controversial that I think are quite good. The first one is that it establishes a multiverse. And the reason I think that this is important is a lot of people are trying to sort of place this in the setting of, well, you know, we live in a time where everyone has to have a cinematic universe, where everything has to fit together. For some reason, we've decided that's the way that things are going to be. The Cloverfield anthology pushes back on that. It says, no, there are these different multiverses. And so you don't know in what reality things are happening. And so it is not necessary. Everything can be thematically connected, but it's not necessary for the characters to be connected. And also what this, I think, allows us to do is to say, okay, even in future films, even we as the audience, even though we've seen 3, 4, 5, until they stop the anthology, even though we've seen these other films, we actually don't know any more than they do. And we can be left just like they were. I think one of the things that people did not like about Cloverfield 2 is that for the first 80% of it, it's just this thriller, a fantastic thriller. And of course, it's not until we get to the surface that we discover that John Goodman's character has been telling the truth. Still a bad guy, but is legitimately a savior while also legitimately being a captor at the same time. And so a lot of people, I think, who watched 10 Cloverfield Lane didn't know what they're getting into. Were like, wait, why did it suddenly turn to science fiction? I think that that's really helpful because the characters also are left thinking, like, well, what exactly has happened here? And you could legitimately, understanding this multiverse scenario, redo 10 Cloverfield Lane, where when she gets up, it turns out that John Goodman's character is crazy, and that the things that are going on have nothing to do with them, or he is not the same, he's simply the captor, or he is in some way connected with some sort of interdimensional being that has captured them, or whatever. You know, we've seen the characters in the Cloverfield paradox, Cloverfield 3, struggle with this. And Donald Logue's character, scientist, who I think they gave his name briefly, points out, well, this can also be things in the future, in the past. And this is a kind of nod, I assume, to Cloverfield Overlord, which is supposed to come out, which is supposedly set in World War II. You got to be careful with Cloverfield because they like to put out false information to trick you. But because of this, we entering into that actually are not going to know any more about what's happening. We might know why it's happening because of this shepherd thing, but that doesn't help really anything that's going to be going on the ground in that. And so when we enter into it, we're not going to know anymore. And as long as they keep the focus tight on one person or two people, I think that it's one group of people. I think it will also have that same kind of potential for emotional power. I think the one important element for thinking about this is I don't think it's helpful to talk about it as a franchise, because even though franchise is a relatively neutral term, in this age which is dominated by cinematic universes, people want to fit them together. And because they want to fit them together, they come in with a certain set of expectations. And as those who watch regularly know, I'm very critical of the cinematic universe. In this case, though, I think it's better to think of it as an anthology. Anthology like, say, Black Mirror or something, where, and I know Black Mirror keeps trying to set it up so it's in the same universe, but realistically, there's no reason for that. So that each thing that happens is thematically connected, but because they're in different multiverses, they don't have to connect in other ways. Or they could. and you don't know going in whether it's going to or not. Cloverfield seems to have sort of backed into itself as a franchise. It seems to have never, not intended to be this kind of franchise, and each of the films seems to have intended to be something different and then been sort of pulled into this. In fact, the whole idea, I was in the movie theater a few weeks ago, and the girl working behind the ticket counter told me that, oh yes, in a few weeks we're going to have the third Cloverfield movie here, and I was pretty happy. And then I saw it didn't come out because in the meantime, between then and now, Netflix bought it and released it, and as part of this sort of bold plan here. And I actually think that that's pretty useful for the series. This kind of sense of lack of expectation, and a kind of meta sense that what we expect is not necessarily what is going to happen, that you don't exactly know what's going to happen. At a time when it's rare for me to go into a movie and not know what is going to happen. Even knowing that 10 Cloverfield Lane, or Cloverfield 2, was a Cloverfield movie, it wasn't clear by the end whether what John Goodman said was true, or whether what he said was true months ago and he had just sort of kept it, and it had not progressed to the point that it had. A lot of people are going to disagree with that. They want everything to hold together in a single sort of universe, basically. And I understand that as an impulse. And if that's something which you need, if you need every, Marvel movie to work with every other Marvel movie, if you desperately need Guardians of the Galaxy to interact with, with the other characters who are on Earth, I guess then this is not for you. But from my view, thinking of this as an anthology, I think really frees us up from some false expectations and allows us to go into the next Cloverfield movie going like, with Cloverfield, what we're going to see is a crisis that's focused on a small group of people with limited information, and we as the audience also have limited information and have to cope with that as well. So, that's all for this review. I hope you enjoyed it, minions.